The New Millennium, an introduction. The new millennium brought in significant changes and renewed hope for many Americans. The election of the first black president, Barack Obama, and the first appointed Latina Supreme Court judge, Sotomayor, are two examples of the changing times. However, anti war activism, LGBTQ and immigrant rights, anti police repression, abolition of prison campaigns, and environmental justice projects are a continuous reminder that the struggle for social justice, both domestically and internationally, is far from over. The growing militarization of black and brown communities during the 1980s and 1990s continued in the new millennium. Data from the Malcolm X Grassroots Organization, an Oakland based organization, revealed that a black person is killed by a police officer, security guard, or vigilante every 28 hours. Of course, not all make the evening news, but the killings of Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, Sean Bell, Alex Nieto, Andrew Lopez, Tamir Rice, and Sandra Bland sparked national outrage. A once depoliticized generation began the slow but necessary process of day-to-day organizing in their communities against police repression in the form of teach-ins, hunger strikes, shutting down of freeways, occupying shopping malls, and the reclaiming of Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King Jr. holiday marches and protests. The growing movement not only inspired the multitudes to lead, participate, contribute, and support, it also produced tangible results, such as the firing of San Francisco Police Chief, restructuring of the Ferguson Police Department, ending the repressive stop and frisk policy in New York, and new nationwide demands on racial, cultural, and de escalation trainings for police departments. Given that the U.S. is a country of immigrants, it is of no surprise that the new millennium would continue to struggle with the issue of immigration. H.R. 4437, or the 2005 Sensenbrenner bill, expressed the resurfacing anti immigrant rallying call. This federal bill increased border security, criminalized undocumented entry to the U.S., and prohibited any aid to undocumented immigrants. This bill, in effect, would potentially turn communities on each other, forcing educators, health workers, and other community services to report undocumented immigrants to authorities. While supporters of the bill gambled that it would decrease immigration and force those in the country to either repatriate or live in the shadows, it actually resulted in the opposite, triggering a re-politicizing of the immigrant community. Unprecedented levels of immigrants filed for citizenship, began voting at the polls, and publicly protesting in every major urban area across the country. US based organizers for May 1st International Workers' Day renamed this day of celebration and protest International Workers and Migrants Day, reflecting the changing demographics of labor in the US. Over the years, an older generation, predominantly white male, had to make room for a feminized immigrant workforce, underlining the complex and yet intimate connection between labor and immigrant rights. The new working class found traditional factory workers marching alongside janitors, teachers, nurses, students, and environmental and anti war activists. Since then, a multitude of organizations and well orchestrated actions have resulted in increased immigrant protections and rights. The Dreamers movement, in particular, has been at the center of passing legislation. While falling short of meeting all the demands, recent legislation have increased pathways to citizenship, kept families together, those with undocumented parents and native born children, and increased access to higher education, making student grants and loans available. Alongside students and community activists, the resurfacing of labor unions, in particular small but growing and committed organizations, mostly women, have passed critical domestic workers' protection legislation. Along with the racial and immigrant rights movements, the LGBTQ, or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community has experienced many social and political victories. This civil rights struggle originated long before it gained national attention, when most politicians and other public figures maintained a distance or outright condemned gays and lesbians. The LGBTQ community continued to fight against discrimination. The Stonewall riots projected LGBTQ rights into the public imagination in 1969, and consistent victories and progress continued during the 1980s, 1990s, and into the early 2000s. Gays and lesbians created safe communities throughout the country, such as the Castro in San Francisco, where they could live openly and freely express their sexuality and lifestyle. Little by little, Americans began to embrace change as more and more public personalities, openly gay and lesbian entertainers, politicians, and sports athletes began to come out of the closet. By the early 2000s, court cases challenged the Don't Ask, Don't Tell armed forces policy that allowed gays and lesbians to serve in the military so long as they remained in the closet. And by 2015, the federal Supreme Court argued in favor of same sex marriage. While attitudes of acceptance reflect progress in new legislation guarantees more equal protection, heteronormative backlash continues to underline conservative Americans' resistance to change. Several states are still arguing against same sex marriage, while other court cases reveal discrimination against the LGBTQ community based on religious grounds. The new millennium also brought in growing class inequality at extremes unparalleled in our history. Regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality, the standard of living for poor, working class, and even middle class Americans began to rapidly erode. While the earnings of the ruling class continued to multiply, new socio-class categories such as the fraction of the 1% and super wealthy more accurately define the concentration of wealth and power. In The Untold History of the United States, Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick note that between 2009 to 2011, national income grew by $505 billion. Pre tax corporate profits grew by $465 billion. Wages and salaries, however, declined by a sobering $22 billion. In Requiem for an American Dream, Noam Chomsky explains that the New Deal federal regulations in the 1940s, 1950s regulated banks and Wall Street, stabilizing the economy, resulting in no periodic economic recessions while raising the standard of living for the working and middle classes. However, deregulation policies beginning in the 1960s freed big banks and corporations from government oversight, launching decades of risky and many times immoral but technically legal business practices. In addition, the outsourcing of jobs, the shift from producing and manufacturing to financing also greatly impacted the working and middle classes. Many basic aspirations such as home ownership, retirement security, access to health care, and sending children to college became more and more impossible for the majority of the population. The decades of bad business policies and practices with very little government oversight, known as free market capitalism, led the country into the Great Recession of 2008. Millions of Americans, levels not seen since the Great Depression, lost their savings, homes, and could not find work. Not only were more Americans falling into poverty, fewer and fewer were able to escape. Mobility studies shattered the myth that the United States was a society with fluid class lines and easy upward mobility. In fact, the United States, with its poor social safety net, failing schools, and low percentage of unionized workers, had considerably less social mobility than any other advanced industrial society. The country responded with the Occupy movement. The other 99% protested the big banks, Wall Street, and corporate America. A united front of poor, working, and middle class Americans from all walks of life, the unemployed, janitors, housewives, small business owners, mid level managers of business, police officers, teachers, environmentalists, and students occupied public and private spaces for weeks, in some cases, months. In these massive gatherings across the country, protesters educated each other on specific issues, promoted alternatives to capitalism, democratically strategized actions, and demanded that the government bail out the people, not the banks. Unfortunately, however, the Obama administration would cave in to corporate America, providing very little support to the suffering millions and allocating trillions of taxpayers' dollars to the very same people who caused the economic crisis. The war on terrorism. With the fall of the Soviet Union and ending of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the United States found itself enemyless and consequently without a clear and cohesive justification for its nuclear arsenal. Between 800 and 1,000 overseas military bases and inflated military budget. The U.S. military budget is more than the next 13 countries combined. With some of the largest oil reserves, along with other natural resources in the Middle East, geopolitical positioning in that part of the world became paramount for the United States. The war on communism shifted to the war on terrorism, and the fear of communists shifted to the fear of terrorists. Since World War II, U.S. intervention in Middle East affairs was minimal compared to Latin America, but impactful nonetheless and steadily increased through the 1980s and 1990s. Most notably, the economic and military support of Israel's occupation of Palestine, the U.S. support of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, and the 1991 attack on and the United States attack on and decades long economic embargo of Iraq. After 9/11, however, series of attacks included the World Trade Center and the Pentagon carried out by Al Qaeda. The US shifted full economic and military strength to the Middle East. The world was shocked, and the international community expressed their sympathy and support for America. Equally shocking for the international community, however, but not surprising, was the immediate bombing and occupation of Afghanistan, where U.S. intelligence argued that the Taliban harbored Al Qaeda terrorists. Moving quickly during American state of fear and with all out support from corporate media outlets, Congress voted for war with little to no debate on its impact on civilians in Afghanistan, already devastated by decades of war with the Soviet Union, or the cost of American soldiers' lives. One lone Congresswoman, Barbara Lee, stood against the tide and voted against the use of force. But was the attack and occupation really about 9/11, or as we've seen with the countless times before, as if bombing and occupying one country is not enough, the Bush administration pushed further and began targeting Iraq. With sketchy military and CIA evidence, corporate media again beat the war drums with WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. For weeks, every major media outlet bombarded American psyche with Saddam Hussein's 20th century Hitler and imagery of weapons of mass destruction. But was the attack and occupation really about 9/11, or as we've seen with the countless times before, was 9/11 the justification for American occupation? In The Untold History of the United States, Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick points out that London banker Ian Hannan, a mining expert with J.P. Morgan, argued that Afghanistan could be one of the leading producers of copper, gold, lithium, and iron ore in the world. It has a mineral wealth. It has a mineral wealth at least $3 trillion. The wars also rebooted multi-million industrial military complex through military construction and other related contracts. Amidst American corporate profits and corrupt Afghan and Iraqi elites increasing their wealth through bribes and payoffs, countless civilians suffered the turmoils of war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. American soldiers by the thousands and their families also suffered greatly. By 2010, 115,000 troops suffered mild traumatic brain injuries that could possibly cause long term mental and physical damage. And this is a low count given the tens of thousands that go unreported. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs noted that more veterans have committed suicide since 2001 than we have lost on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. Congresswoman Barbara Lee was not alone, however, as thousands immediately took to the streets protesting the wars. A younger, inexperienced but vibrant and energized generation of activists merged with the older and experienced generation of anti war activists, organizing anti war marches in every major urban center across the nation. They demanded an end to the bombings, immediate American troops withdrawal, and American tax dollars be used for employment, housing, education, and other social services, not war. During the initial invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq, the media coverage was akin to a video game spectacle. Newscasters focused on the shock and awe of smart bombs and other sophisticated U.S. weaponry, but paid no attention to its devastating impact on civilians. Death, disfigurement, cities blown to rubble, water and agricultural fields poisoned, and psychological trauma. By the early 2000s, the media stopped almost all coverage of the war, including the nightly American soldier death toll. This biased media coverage left the average American in the dark and consequently slowly reduced active participation in anti war demonstrations and related acts of protest. With the presidency of Obama, many war weary Americans hoped for a radical shift in U.S. Middle Eastern policy. However, the Obama administration orchestrated the exact opposite and pursued and expanded the war on terror. As the US government slowly withdrew American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, it increased the use of drone warfare. With the use of drones expanding throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, including Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and the Philippines, the Obama administration could punish terrorists without American troop commitment. The international community continued to question the legality of drone strikes, and individuals arguing the U.S. is engaging in extrajudicial killings. The Pakistani press reports that over the past 3 years, the U.S. drone strikes had killed 700 civilians and only 14 terrorist leaders. U.S. drone attacks have also targeted and killed American citizens in the Middle East, most, nob- most notably US born Al Qaeda supporter Anwar al Awlaki and his 16-year-old son. The family of Anwar al Awlaki filed lawsuits with the ACLU arguing that the killings violated fundamental rights afforded to all U.S. citizens, including the right not to be deprived of life without due process of law. President Bush began withdrawing of American troops from Iraq in 2007 and President Obama in 2014, both claiming victory. However, most Americans asked, what victory? 55% of the American public argued that the wars were a mistake. Yes, Saddam was dethroned and Osama bin Laden was assassinated, but at what cost? Both countries have been completely destroyed. Resentment of US and other Western powers' military presence and intervention continues to fester. Tribal and ethnic conflicts have escalated, and there is absolutely no signs of democracy. According to the UN's Gender Related Development Index, after 8 years of American occupation and reform, Afghanistan still ranks second to the bottom in female literacy, access to education, and life expectancy. Most importantly, the continued night raids and kidnappings, drone attacks, and use of torture has enraged local populations. This, along with the fact that U.S. intervention has destabilized the region, has also paved the way for terrorist organizations such as ISIS and the resurgence of Al Qaeda. This is an introduction. Details and further analysis are included in the assigned materials.